Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and a number of other online venues. It has been said that nobody ever went broke banking on human irrationality. And when you look at the headlines these days, it's hard to argue with that. In fact, I have friends and colleagues who have to restrict how much news they see during the week because it just plunges them into despair, whether it's overheating of the planet almost completely unchecked, economies that fail billions of people and always have, a pandemic whose real sources ecologically are not being addressed at all, which only sets us up for more pandemics and more variants. Here in the States, on one side of the political divide, people are saying that a 10-year-old should be forced to give birth. On the other side, the other supposedly more rational side, the woke police are purging the academies of anyone who doesn't use their precisely coded language. We could easily produce other examples. Cynicism, therefore, and disillusionment really are the easy position these days. And they don't demand much. If you just feel cynical about the human prospect altogether and cynical about human nature, it doesn't require anything of you. You can sit back and complain to your heart's content, or actually your heart's discontent. There's no responsibility to take up. There's nothing you have to do differently. You don't have to worry about answering what may resonate in your psyche as the call of the planet or the call of your fellow human beings. You don't have to improve anything. You can just let it all go. And worry primarily about yourself, which is really what this is all about. Some of us, however, refuse to do that, and we put to ourselves the difficult questions, one of which is, how did things get to this point? Now, there's no one-size-fits-all grand answer. There's many answers from many fields of human activity: political, religious, scientific, you name it, philosophical. But there is one thread that I'd like to pick up here because it leads to what I want to be the heart of this podcast, which takes its cue from a comment of Abraham Maslow's that we tend to sell human nature short. The thread I'm picking up has to do with emotional maturity, with coming of age. When you look at the world too long through a psychological lens, you tend to see things in terms of pathology and mental disorders. So you have people who say, for instance, Donald Trump is a malignant narcissist, or this politician suffers from this, or that religious leader suffers from that, any of which may be true, although it's diagnosing from a distance. But I think it's more informative to look at things through a developmental lens. And what we see is the spectacle across most of our cultures on this planet of people in leadership positions who not only don't know how to lead, they don't know how to collaborate. They don't know how to manage their own feelings. They don't know how to stop projecting onto their opponents. There's a whole raft of skills that they never acquired that fully adult people have to master in order to be fully adult people. So it seems to me that a more useful lens is that of maturation. Otherwise, we're stuck in the position of saying, well, there's neurotics on every side, and I'm a little neurotic too, and so on and so forth. It doesn't really get us anywhere to think that way. It may be true and it may not be true. But what we can say is that there are, anyone can count an endless number of public figures who never grew up. They're walking around in adult bodies, and they're saying things that range anywhere from 2 years old to teens. Given how they affect most of us, it's no wonder our worldviews need therapy. But the good news here is that it is possible to grow up. So, on a very small scale, I would like to provide a few anecdotes from my days in men's groups. And the groups I'm referring to were for court mandated men who committed acts of violence, and they served a sentence either in jail or prison for that violence, and afterwards they came to our groups and they learned much more than anger management. When I began my 6 years of co-facilitating such groups and eventually directing them and training other therapists to do this kind of work, I didn't think I was going to like it. I went to my first day in one of Scott Barella's groups at Cornerstone Counseling, and I was kind of skeptical. And as I recall, there was 12 men in the room, plus the two counselors, both of us. And I thought, well, Scott invited me, so I'm going to see what's going on here, and then maybe move on to a different internship. That was the reason I was there, was to complete my intern hours. By the end of the group session, I was so amazed and just plain blown away by the quality of the interactions between Scott and the men and the distance he had brought them, partly through technique, partly through being a role model, through respectful confrontation, and a number of other things, that I decided on the spot I wanted to stay and learn at least a little bit of what he was doing. So I ended up doing that for 6 years, usually 3 or 4 times a week. At one point, even though I was still an intern, I directed a counseling center that specialized in that kind of work. And the clients we had ranged in terms of offenses from battery all the way up to murder. We got occasionally assaultive men on one end of the continuum, and on the other, an occasional psychopath, but not too many of those. So it's correct, I think, to say that during those 6 years, I got to see the inside of most of the evil that human beings can do to one another on the level of violence. And the startling thing for me was I became a firm optimist about human nature and human possibility. And I have been ever since. Now, I sometimes hear, unfortunately, even from psychotherapists, that you can't force people to change, and therefore making them be in such groups is a waste of time. Yes, that's true that you can't make people change, but I disagree with the second part. The fact of the matter is, at Cornerstone Counseling, we had above a 90% success rate during the time I was there, largely because of Scott, I might add, who is the one who was really skilled at this kind of work. And by 90%, what I mean is that 90% of the men who went fully through our program did not reviolate their probation. Scott had put together a curriculum drawn from many different sources. He had a lot of background and a lot of training in dealing with this population of men, and we taught them anger management skills, of course, how to negotiate instead of trying to just barge your way through situations, how to sit with your feelings, how to name your feelings. We educated them about basic psychology and how their own minds worked. We did some inner child work with them. It was a pretty full plate. And on a storytelling level, I gave them a bit of the hero's journey to reframe their current situation and all its tribulations, and to encourage them to get to a higher place. And through it all, what we insisted on is that they act like adults and that they speak like adults. So we wouldn't let them use their badder language, like calling their partners ball and chain, for instance, or that bitch, or whatever it is. We taught them to speak differently, to think in more mature terms, had them practice in the groups, and we always encouraged them, go home and try this out and let us know how it works. What will work for this guy over here won't work for you, and vice versa. So we need to figure out what does work for you. We confronted them when they were in denial. We did it firmly and respectfully. I remember a group where the men started to use the check-in period at the beginning to posture and about their combat prowess, and I put my foot on that pretty quickly, and I said, if you're done posturing, we have men's work to do in here. And so through little interventions along the way, we tried to show them what we had attempted to learn in terms of being peaceful members of this society. We also had the nerve to give them assertiveness training because a lot of these men didn't know how to advocate for themselves, for instance, at work or in situations where they were being abused by a boss or a colleague or someone else they routinely interacted with who had more power over them than they desired. And when we showed them how to stand up for themselves in a peaceful way and they successfully did that, we praised them for it. And I can't tell you how many times guys in groups said, I had no idea I had these kinds of options available. We taught them about male privilege and how they exhibit it. We taught them about the displaceability of anger and how when you're stewing on something in one part of your life, you're liable to take it out on some powerless person in another part of your life. We taught them about patriarchy and the power dynamics it puts in place. Occasionally, men left the group because they went back to jail or prison, and we always told them, well, save your seat, go do your time and come back, and then we'll take up where we left off. There was one interesting group where I decided to do a little experiment. We were working on issues from our past and how emotional pain stays with us until we heal it. And I said to the guys in the group, I was running this group, I said, I want you guys to raise your hand if you have had a decent relationship with your mother or a mother figure. And most of the group put their hands up. And I said, now I want you to raise your hand if you had a decent relationship with your father or a father figure growing up. Not a single hand went up. And as we sat there thinking about all that, I saw some tears begin running down the faces of the men in the room. And I thought, yeah, this is where the big wound is. There's been a habit in psychology to blame mom for everything, but in this case, there was a lot of father wounding. And I repeated that experiment in other groups, and it always turned out the same. It's a father issue, all of this. Absent fathers, fathers who are violent and abusive, fathers who just don't care, and in turn are pressured by the societies in which they live, the places in which they work. I'm totally convinced that one of the reasons my dad was violent was because he was so badly treated at work over and over and over again, and he just came home feeling castrated. That's not to excuse his violence. There is no excuse for it. But it is to provide a fuller understanding of the fact that when you tear people's self-esteem down day after day, they're going to respond. It was interesting to see also the point at which men would stop playing around and just think of this as, I just have to do this bullshit for the court, for my sentencing, and then they would start to get interested. You could always see that transition. And I remember seeing men sleeping out near the counseling center because they didn't have jobs, being felons. They couldn't get one anywhere. They didn't have homes, some of them. They were sleeping out in their cars, or they had run out of absences and they lived at a distance from the office. And they knew that in California at that time, you get 6 absences and any more you go back to jail. And they were determined to get through. They were determined to make it happen. And a number of men told us, now, at first I did this just to comply, but now I'm doing this for me and my family, and my future relationships. Now, one of the truisms of psychotherapy is that below anger is sorrow. Well, sometimes. That's sometimes true. And sometimes it's the other way around. I've met plenty of people who have an easier time being sad than getting in touch with the depths of their anger, the roots of their rage. But in either case, underneath both sadness and anger and a number of other things, we find wounding, we find trauma. And what made me an optimism about people is that over and over, I saw that not everybody, I'm going to have to disagree with Carl Rogers on that point, but the majority of people who were given respectful attention and the opportunity to address their trauma and heal, at least partially from it, they began acting in ways that were more responsible, beneficial, and emotionally mature. I saw this over and over and over again. Most people respond to intelligent care that holds them responsible for their actions in ways that lead toward healing and maturity. People are not born violent, just as they're not born sexist or racist or in any other form of intolerance. They come by it by being trained into it, by being traumatized into it, and coming out of situations where nobody expects anything but bad news from them. No one holds them accountable. And that's a problem we see all over the world, especially with our leadership, but in many other areas too. You see it in the workplace, where people get away with whole careers where they basically don't even do their jobs. And some of them even get promoted. You see it in religious circles. It's just absolutely ubiquitous. I remember when President Biden got elected, and a number of people said, well, I don't really like him, and he seems really out of touch, but at least he's not foaming at the mouth crazy. That's how low the bar is now. If someone isn't walking around in an active psychotic state, then maybe they'll be okay as president. Is that not pathetic? There was a group I attended where the men were kind of regressed. And you see that in long-term education and therapy both, where people make progress for a while and then they kind of take a step or two back. This was one of those groups. And I was getting pretty sick of hearing their pissing and moaning. And they were kind of retreating to the child position and poor me and all that. And so when you do group therapy, especially with this population, when it serves the process, you can be a bit more self-disclosive than you would in other kinds of therapy. So at one point, I stopped the check-in, and I said, we're stopping because I need to tell you guys how really disappointed I am with how you're acting today. I thought you guys were at a much higher level, and you're in here using that same stupid batterer language that you used before. You're demeaning women with how you talk about them, your same racist attitudes and all of that. I really thought you guys were past a lot of this. Are you not aware that when I drive around in this town, I listen to the radio because I'm waiting for news of one of you guys being arrested, hurt, or killed? I worry about you guys constantly, off the job as well as on it. Do you know that? And the thing that frustrates me the most is that you're better than this. I've seen it in you. I've seen all of you in interactions where you say some marvelous deep thing that's insightful about your relationships, or you go into new territory and you explore a new skill, or whatever it is. And when I see you do that, I see you acting like men. Adult, mature, responsible men. That's what I want from you. That's what I expect from you. Because underneath all your fussing and your raging and everything else you're doing in here today, there's something that apparently you never got enough nurturing for. The potential to be a grown-up human being who can do some good in the world, who people can look at and say, I'd really like to be like that guy someday. So a number of the men came up to me afterwards and told me that either right after that session or later along their career with us, they said that, that was a turning point for me. I never had a man tell me that I could be better than what I was today. And I appreciated hearing that from them, but it also made me sad, not just for them, but for all of us, because having someone expect us to be better should just be baseline. That should be part of growing up, everywhere. Even though I grew up in a violent place, I was lucky in the sense that I always seemed to find people who had faith in me. Many of them were teachers, and they're one of the reasons I became one. But also therapists and friends and some members of my family, colleagues, many different kinds of people over the years. And I used that as a source of strength. I used that to build the faith that I had both in myself and my growing faith in other people. Not the conviction that they would always do the right thing if allowed to. That's more like belief, and personally I think belief is highly overrated. What I'm talking about is the faith that people can make use of these opportunities and do better. Not that they inevitably will. That to me is not what faith in humanity means at all. It means that we can do better. It means that when we look at the news, something in us can respond by saying, we're better than this. It doesn't have to be this way. But it's so easy to forget that and to lapse into a kind of cynical helplessness. I see that at work sometimes in what shows up as a sort of, we can't do this because. I call it Kantianism. Not with a K, as in the philosopher, but with the C. There's a lot of Kantians out there who just don't know any better. It's a knee-jerk response to the idea that things can change. It's a defense. It's a way of warding off the necessity of doing things differently. Some years ago, I, with a lot of help, created the first ecotherapy certificate anywhere. And I recall a certain faculty senate meeting where we were debating how to get the thing running. And I heard a lot of Kantianism. We can't do it because of this. We can't do it because of that. And I finally got impatient. And I said, I can think of my own reasons why this won't work. I don't need your help for that. But there will be an ecotherapy certificate. And I will launch it because I can. And I did. I'm in my late 50s and I'm reinventing my career because I can. And what I also hope I'm doing, which is far more important than simply reinventing a career, is offering new ways to look at the kinds of stories that keep us stuck so we can unstick ourselves and move forward together where we really want to go. If we do a bit of lorologizing and look at those stories, our guiding stories, I call them keystone stories, which we use to navigate through life, we can melt them down, so to speak, into the bits and pieces of image and aspiration, old stories, old practices, even old mythic and folkloric structures hanging around, and coagulate those stories, cook those stories into new forms that would suit us better, that would help us be more mature, more humane, more ecologically aware, and more able to look out for ourselves and each other during this difficult time. By doing this kind of therapy on our worldviews, as well as on our guiding stories, maybe we can open up some new possibilities for enjoying a bit more our time here with each other on this beautiful planet, for navigating difficulties, for drawing on internal resources that perhaps we didn't even think we had, and for finding courage to face what we're up against. There's a fine quote I've always liked from Paul Tillich's book, The Courage to Be. It takes tremendous courage to resist the lure of appearances. The power of being, which is manifest in such courage, is so great that the gods tremble in fear of it. It's been interesting to me to conduct a little experiment over the past couple of years in learning to write fiction, which for a long time I assumed I just wasn't any good at, and for all I know, I'm still not. You can be the judge of that. But I've written a cycle of speculative fiction stories, a little bit of science fiction here, a little bit of fantasy there, called the Assembling Terrania cycle, which I'm going to devote probably a couple of podcasts to down the road. The word Terrania came to me one night when I was fantasizing about the kind of planet I wanted to live on, the kind of earth-honoring, diverse, just, welcoming, belonging, and just plain fun civilization I'd like to be a part of. Hence the word Terrania. And I'm using it as a fantasy word, both in the sense of an aspiration and also a goal for the species. There's no single version of it. I think it would be great if we all dreamed up our own version. But what I wanted to do is set out a cycle of stories that show us progressing toward it. Not in a linear line of development, but through 1,000 mistakes, misunderstandings, tragedies, even deaths. Painfully climbing our way into a more mature, a more soulful place as a species. That's what the cycle lays out. It starts way back with the Big Bang, and it goes all the way into the future toward the achievement of Terrania. And it's been interesting for me to notice the internal resistances that have come up along the way. So I just mentioned one of them. I can't write fiction. I can write nonfiction. I've written a lot of nonfiction, but writing fiction is a whole different thing. When you write nonfiction, you're explaining things to people, but that's the death of good fiction. And when I started writing it, I was seeking out some criticism from people who actually know what they're doing in this area. And one of the first things they told me was, "You're over-explaining. You sound like an essayist." And I probably still do in places, but I'm learning to dramatize. I'm learning to write from the imagination in a way that I couldn't before. So what I'm learning is that I actually can write fiction. Perhaps it's not very good fiction, but I'm more or less happy with it. I'm always fiddling with it and trying to get it to be better. But it seems necessary for me to offer some kind of imagining about how we can get there along this, what I call the long adventure, the path not just toward consciousness, but toward a deeper kind of living on this planet where we don't have governments that go off the rails, where we don't have millions of people without jobs, where we don't bake our planet. Imagine a society of human beings who are sane, who are delighted to be there, who like each other, who not only tolerate difference but appreciate it. And of course, part of the inspiration for this was Star Trek, but there were many others, just as there are many names for Terrania. 23rd century, 24th century, Shangri-La, and the list goes on and on. And what I wanted to be careful to do was not present utopia, because I don't believe in utopia. I don't believe that human beings, as human beings, will ever achieve a state where all we do is sit around and play harps. Nor would I want to live in such a world. As one of my characters puts it, there are no impregnable utopias. We always have to be vigilant because we're always imperfect human beings, and we make mistakes and we fall short. So will our constructions of and experiments in how to make an enlightened society. So I'm mentioning this to challenge you. What does your vision of a better life look like? What do you imagine beyond what you see in the news? How can we be better? How can you be better? And what are some specific examples of being better, of doing it right, of overcoming adversity in ways that are beautiful and noble and courageous? What are the everyday acts of kindness, courage, and creativity that keep our whole species going, day after day? And notice in all this that we're not necessarily talking about a heroic psychology or heroic activity. We're talking about acting from inspiration and hope and dream. We're acting from the faith that things will not inevitably improve, but that they can improve, that we can do better. And that just maybe enough of us get together and dream together, we will do better. Thank you.